What's up guys, welcome back to Elderway Games. Thomas here, and have you ever thought about what 40k could be like if we swapped from I Go You Go to alternating activations? That's what I'd like to kind of talk about today, maybe some pros and cons as to, what it would be like if we were to make this swap, and why I might think that how it is now is the best option for this game as a whole. So let's get into it. First off, what is I Go You Go versus alternating activations? So I Go You Go basically means that one player gets to perform all their game actions, and then the second player gets to perform all of their game actions, and they go back and forth until the end of the game and a winner is determined. Whereas alternating activations basically means that you activate one unit at a time, performing all of its actions and going back and forth between each player until all units have moved or until a predetermined number of actions have been completed. There are war games that do alternating activations. Stuff like One Page Rules, their games are all alternating activation, and I think there's a really cool opportunity there. I think alternating activations is definitely an interesting way for a turn structure to be laid out, because you really kind of get the option to counterplay your opponents immediately instead of basically waiting for their entire turn to be done. I definitely think there are some pros to that. Namely is just alpha striking is almost impossible, right? And alternating activations, because you can only move one unit at a time, that means that you're pushing a unit into potentially line of fire of your opponent, and your opponent will be able to effectively move to counter that move in their turn and potentially just knock out a unit. You can see that as a good thing or a bad thing, but it does end up making it so that everyone is on, honestly, a bit more of an even playing field, which I do like about alternating activations. I think there could be a place for it in a game that I play in the future, but I don't know if 40k is the right place for it. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But of course, with alternating activations, because you're able to perform an action, see what your opponent does, and then immediately perform it again, you're able to basically just have this nice rhythm of back and forth with your opponent in a way that you just don't really have in the I Go You Go structure of 40,000. With those things being said, I Go You Go allows for a bit more of a narrative experience, in my opinion, because you're able to effectively move your entire board forward and perform all actions at one time with minimal interaction from your opponent. You kind of get the feeling of my entire army moving forward and being able to command a vast array of units. And of course, sometimes you get the Alpha Strike situation where you are able to move into positions where you're able to take out a considerable amount of your opponent's forces. While this can feel pretty powerful, it does feel a bit of a feels bad for your opponent. And in the I Go You Go structure, deployment is king, in my opinion. If you have a bad deployment and you go second, you end up getting just absolutely pummeled by your opponent, being able to move into a position and be able to take out a lot of your stuff in one go. This feels really bad, and as you know in some of my previous videos, I'm not big on feel bads in any game, but in 40,000, I think that learning deployment is part of the fun and part of the skill involved in the game, and I think that learning how to deploy your stuff and how to use your reserves properly is something that as you learn it, you end up adapting it into your own strategy, and it actually ends up being a pretty fun part of the game. Granted, it is unfortunate that a lot of times you learn that through the hard knocks of getting tabled or half tabled on the first turn, but that is part of the I Go You Go structure, and I think that while it is definitely a con to the structure of I Go You Go, I think that the ability to learn from that and the ability to learn how to counteract that in unique ways is part of its strengths. Now let's talk about it as a whole and why switching 40k from I Go You Go to alternating activations may not be the best idea. The first one that comes to mind is simply stratagems. You got to think most of our stratagems are active against opponents and reactive to things that they do in their turn. Those things would likely not be feasible or really ideal in the situations that we're talking about in alternating activations. For example, Fire Overwatch would be basically useless because you can just move the unit nearest to them and be able to shoot anyway. and it would add a little bit if you had to make sure that you don't move and shoot your best return fire unit. Then of course things like heroically intervening, counteroffensive, and the like wouldn't have a place, because you'd basically move into combat, fight with a unit, and then fight back, and then it would be your turn and you would be able to move and fight into another unit, and then they would fight back. So there's no real reason to dive into counteroffensives and that sort of thing, and it would just make it be that you get to alternate fighting anyway. Whereas, of course, with I Go You Go, you're able to charge your units in, fight with all of them or most of them, and then if your opponent has the command points available to be able to counteroffensive, to interrupt your charge phase, then they do. And if they don't, they don't. And I think that there are certain parts of 40K that just simply don't work with alternating activations. It would have to be a pretty big overhaul of how the system works in general to accommodate something that I don't really think is going to make that much of a difference for the better. The next thing that I would be concerned with if we were to switch to alternating activations is game length. I mean, 40K games are already pretty long, and some people argue that this is because of I Go You Go. But you have to think, the alternating activations of two different armies going back and forth, and basically the multiple mini decisions that you're making every single time is going to add up probably near exponentially. If you go and you move all your stuff, you shoot all your stuff, you charge some stuff in, and you fight, and then it's now your opponent's turn to go on turn one, there's a lot of decisions that you made. But you're not having to change your decisions after each time your opponent makes a move, which would happen in I Go You Go. And I know you might argue, well, your opponents also made the decisions, and the back and forth may end up making you go faster. I don't really agree. From turn one, you already kind of have an idea of where your units are going to move to, and then you react based on what happens in your opponent's turn one and what you do in turn two. Maybe using stratagems to react to what they do in the turn, but for the most part, you're not really reacting until turn two. And because of how, deadly 40K can be, a lot of times your units are going down much faster as turns go on. So obviously turn two will go a little faster than turn one, turn three than turn two, and so on and so forth, where turn 4 and 5 are usually rather quick, with at least one side usually only having a few more units left to be able to knock out the turn a lot faster. Whereas with alternating activations, sure, you may have some instances where you're trading units a little bit quicker. You're still having that back and forth, and the disparity of unit numbers between armies is a lot bigger in 40K than some of these other games that are designed with alternating activations in mind. Knights in general, even Adeptus Custodes and some Death Guard armies, these are elite armies with very few units. If you're going up against them in this alternating activation with an army that is more of a swarm army, such as Guard or Tyranids, or even Tau in some cases, you have a whole lot more actions to do and a lot more activations against them. How does that balance out? You really think that, a fair game would be that the Knights only get one round of activations? I don't think so. I think Knights are going to end up being able to activate twice per turn. Imagine a Knight being able to move twice, shoot twice, potentially charge and fight twice in a single turn or a single battle round of 40K. They've already been a problem in 10th edition in the competitive scene and on casual tables, just being what they are now. We have to balance the game around this alternating activations, and how do you think we're going to do that? It has to be in the actions. We have to make sure that each army is going to be able to compete with one another in a way that seems fair and seems valid, that makes it so that all the armies actually want to be played. And of course, there could be a counterbalance, right? If it ends up being that Titanic units are able to activate twice in a battle round, there could be a battle, some kind of patch later on that makes it so they maybe just get an additional action. They can shoot again, maybe move again, or they all gain, some form of sticky objective type deal. Ultimately, this disparity between units can vary so much more aggressively in 40K than some of these other games. And I think that would be something that we'd really have to figure out. And while in some cases it may not be a terrible thing where, some of these armies that are more hordish end up getting, pointed into a position where they feel more elite. I don't know if that's necessarily the best for the narrative of the game. An important part of 40K is the narrative. When you're piloting these armies, you're meant to be the commander commanding these forces. And would it really feel right if the Space Marines player and the Tyranids player all have the same number of units? Not really. And especially if you're playing a game where it's Space Marines versus Guard, does it really make sense that there's the same number of units in a Space Marine army than a Guard army? And you could argue, and maybe it would just be a matter of just doubling this unit size of the Guard units to accommodate, but then the Guard players having to buy 2 boxes for every unit that they pilot instead of just the one. I mean, it's already a pretty expensive army as it is, and sure, there might be some balance for that should it move into that, but in reality, like, you're looking now, every unit is, 20 guys. We're going to see a lot more of the Hammer of the Emperor type detachments with just loads and loads of vehicles and tanks, which is already a bit of a problem. And then on top of that, what does that even look like? How is it going to be when the Guard player is literally just Rogal Dorns and Leman Russes just blowing people away every turn? I think Alpha Strike would be almost, honestly, something that could still happen in this alternating activations universe of 40K. And getting back into the narrative, I think one of the wonderful things about the I Go You Go is that you can sort of build the faction to the way that you want. We might end up having to go back to a more force organization type structure like we see in Horus Heresy, which may not be a terrible thing, but at the same time, I really like being able to have the flexibility to build my roster however I want. As long as I have a warlord, I can run as many other units as I want, as long as I'm still within the 3 or 6 unit cap maximum for standard units versus battle line. And for me, that's a really fun way to build. I'm able to build my Tyranids to be super swarmy, super aggressive in that way, have tons and tons of swarm units running across the board with plenty of other monsters to kind of carry up the rear. My Tau are able to have a crazy amount of battle suits, honestly arguably too many, but it makes the force look like the way that I want it to look. For me, I think that's a great part of it. I get to hobby and build the units that I actually want to be playing on the table instead of feeling forced to accommodate units into my army just to match the organization chart that I'm required to do. I just don't think that would be a game that I would want to play. I want to have as much creative liberties and the forces that I'm building as possible. I mean, I just couldn't imagine having to run a certain amount of troops, a certain amount of heavy support, and that sort of thing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on I Go You Go versus alternating activations and what you think is the better direction for 40K. Do you agree that I Go You Go is the best, or do you think that we should swap to alternating activations and have more equal sized armies across the table and that sort of thing? I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below, but thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all in